Long he fought on, and undismayed, though he was wrapped in fire and wounded with many wounds. Fëanor did battle, letting his fury and hatred of the servants of Morgoth join in his battle fervor. And seeing the renewed fire in the son of Finwë, the Balrogs and other servants of Morgoth were driven back. Fëanor could hardly be restrained, pushing onwards and pursuing his enemies towards their home of Angband. Yet it is there that the Elven King would have found his end, had his 7 sons not found their father before he was yet lost in the shadow of Thangorodrim and the darkness of Morgoth. The armies of Angband retreated, and Morgoth yet laughed. The Silmarils glistened in his crown. But he did have more fear for what Fëanor's fury might bring to his iron gates. Still, Fëanor was wounded when his sons brought him back to their camp in Mithrim. But the spirit of he who crafted the Silmarils burned bright and strong. He would recover from these wounds. As Fëanor rested after the battle under stars, word of his arrival eventually came to Thingol, king of Beleriand, in his stronghold of Menegroth and Doriath, by way of his scouts. The son of Finwë and his followers had come to Middle-earth without their lord father, whom Thingol once called friend. Melian the Maia heard this, and she foresaw the doom of Beleriand that pursued Fëanor, but said nothing to her husband. Yet Thingol was not gladdened by this news either, feeling an unknown dread at this, and would send word to Fëanor with tell of the borders of his realm, and that, while Fëanor's Noldor were welcome in Middle-earth, Thingol was the king of Beleriand, and would be regarded as such. Upon receiving this news, Fëanor paid little heed to one whom he believed was some self-declared wood-elven king, caring little for any elf among the Teleri who served Fëanor not. Rather, Fëanor's mind was completely focused on the downfall of Morgoth and the recapture of his Silmarils. His elves made plans, but none seemed feasible enough to bring about the destruction of Angband. Before too much time had passed, the sun and moon appeared in the sky, and far to the east, men awoke in Middle-earth. With the coming of the moon, Fingolfin and his followers, estranged from the Fëanorians as they had been since the burning of the ships of the Teleri, arrived in Middle-earth. Yet Fingolfin, Fëanor's half-brother, had promised himself that he would come face-to-face with his half-brother again. And Fingolfin's host was certainly now far greater in number than Fëanor's, despite having crossed the frozen ice of the Helcaraxe and finding battle themselves afterwards. There, in Mithrim, Fingolfin met his half-brother Fëanor again, and while Fëanor was surprised to see that Fingolfin had actually made the crossing and had not turned back to live in Valinor with their other brother, Finarfin, and respected him for it, he did not hide his dislike and distrust for any of those in Fingolfin's following. Before our crossing in the ships, I heard treacherous whispers from the lot of you, and decided to bring only those who were loyal to me back to Middle-earth. However, in crossing the Helcaraxe, you have shown me that you are not without worth, as I might have thought. Pledge yourselves to me, your king, and aid me in reclaiming my Silmarils, and I promise that the kingdom of the Noldor shall be mightier than the refuge of the Valar in exile in the west, and we shall rule this Middle-earth and throw down Morgoth the enemy. While of course Fëanor's followers were roused by this speech, the elves of Fingolfin mostly heeded it not, having faced many great sacrifices in the cold of the north that Fëanor's words could not easily mend. However, some, even those who hated Fëanor most, were swayed at least somewhat by these words in their hearts, for they wanted to see these specific ends achieved. Galadriel would never follow him, but was not against aiding him in his venture, and Fingon, son and heir of Fingolfin, was glad to be reunited with his cousin Maithros, son of Fëanor, and he rallied to this, but remained loyal to his father Fingolfin. Others like Fingolfin himself, his other son Torgon, and his nephew Finrod, however, would not join with Fëanor. These elves remembered all too well the words of the doom of Mandos, and wished not to aid Fëanor, lest they hasten such fates. And so began the great schism of the Noldor. Without Fëanor's death and the subsequent capture of his son and heir Maithros, and the relinquishing of the crown from Maithros to Fingolfin, there would be no reunion nor feast of reuniting for the Noldor. No, they would rather split and divide themselves further, as many followers of Fingolfin pledged to never follow Fëanor again, feeling betrayed by him, naming Fingolfin as their king, since he had ruled for a time in Tirion when Fëanor had been exiled before the destruction of the Two Trees. Here, at the beginning of the First Age, these two factions of the Noldor almost came to blows, but Fëanor, seeing that his following was still less, removed to the far east of Beleriand, going to Himring and making his kingdom among the nearby mountains. While he cared little for the rest of the Noldor and was enraged at their disloyalty to him, Fëanor's focus remained on Morgoth and the recapture of the Silmarils, as he was bound to his oath. As for King Fingolfin, he would stay in Mithrim, saddened at Fëanor's continued arrogance, but still he and his people would attempt to make the greatest realms they could, both for the good of the Noldor and Middle-earth, as well as in defiance of Morgoth. Fingolfin and Fingon stayed close, making their kingdom in Mithrim, while the children of Finarfin, Fingolfin's brother, went to Doriath and made good relations with Thingol for a time, and Finrod would build Nargothrond while Turgon built Gondolin, just as it happened in the canon. However, due to the deepened divide between the Fëanorians and the followers of Fingolfin, there would be no glorious battle upon Morgoth, no long siege upon Angband for centuries, as there is in the canon. Rather, the followers of Fingolfin in the west and the Fëanorians in the east would generally keep Beleriand clear of Morgoth's forces for quite a long time, as they individually guarded their passes, being mostly in a stalemate with Morgoth in the north. In the meantime, tensions continued to grow between the Noldor of the west and east, who hardly communicated at all, especially after Thingol discovered the truth about the first kinslaying. And since the Noldor were so distinctly divided, he blamed nearly the entire event and the deaths of his brother's people on the followers of Fëanor, and hardly any blame on the followers of Fingolfin, though he still would not aid the Noldor of Fingolfin in the north against Morgoth. And so it was that, a few centuries into the First Age, the Fëanorians had really no allies except for the dwarves of the Blue Mountains that were close to them, for they also excelled in craft, just as Fëanor himself did. Indeed, with the survival of Fëanor, I believe he would continue to build incredible, wondrous, and terrible things, artifacts that would greatly help his faction, but the natures of which are beyond the scope of this theory to guess. With the combined craftsmanship of the dwarves of the Blue Mountains and the arts of Fëanor himself, the greatest weapons in the history of Arda would be forged in Himring, putting even the elven swords of Gondolin like Glamdring and Orcrist to shame. All throughout these centuries, the race of men, the three houses of the Edain especially, continued to make their way westward, coming at last into Osiriand and Thargelion. But due to the starkly divided lands between the Sindar and Noldor of the west, and the Fëanorian Noldor of the east, men would be first found by the elves of Fëanor, seeing them as weak and short-lived beings whose minds could easily be manipulated and turned to violence. Fëanor would enslave many of the Edain who his elves caught, sending them to either work in mines or fields, or forcibly enlisting them as soldiers in their battles against Morgoth. Indeed, with none to really restrain him, Fëanor would continue to fall to his vices, becoming more and more like Morgoth as the years passed. And so he would be as a tyrant to men, being no different in the minds of many than Morgoth was himself. Some men would escape into West Beleriand, and though Thingol did not particularly like them himself, he gave them lands of refuge to live in, as did Fingolfin, with the promises of these men that they would work alongside the elves in battling against Morgoth and in keeping the Fëanorians out of their lands. During this time, Morgoth was not dormant, but gave the Noldor little reason to reunite against him, sending petty attacks against either side, but he became aware of the growing discontent between both factions, and wished to use this divide to his advantage. Therefore he sent his greatest servant, Sauron, in a fair form to Fëanor, acting as a rogue elf from Fingolfin's faction, and to Fingon, Sauron came in this same form, claiming to be an elf from the following of Fëanor, since Fingolfin would never be so easily deceived. And thus Sauron spread lies to each faction about the other, concerning treachery, invasions, and so forth. Fëanor came to believe that Fingolfin wished to have his crafts and crown, to be the sole king of the Noldor. Fingon came to believe that Fëanor was planning to invade their lands in the south, to take Mithrim and slay Fingolfin, to be the sole king of the Noldor once again. And so the eyes of the Noldor turned away from the north, landing upon each other, but still they would not openly attack one another until... A man would eventually escape the thraldom of Fëanor, coming into Doriath. His name was Beren, son of Barahir, and he fell in love with the elf maiden Luthien, daughter of Thingol. He would go on a different version of his quest to reclaim the Silmaril, as many of the events leading up to this event were different, but in the end, Beren would claim a Silmaril from the crown of Morgoth and return it to Doriath. This would not only cause a kinslaying, no, this would ignite a civil war between Fingolfin and Thingol against Fëanor, for the Oath of Fëanor reawakened, and Fëanor invaded Doriath. and Fingolfin's forces went to aid Thingol, and the doom of the Noldor quickly took hold, as at this time, Morgoth invaded, sending forth his dragons and Balrogs, orcs, and trolls to attack the now unprotected lands of Fëanor and Fingolfin, slaying Fingolfin and his son Fingon, and scattering Fëanor and his 7 sons to the wild, who were rather at Doriath themselves and not at Himring. So brutal and total was the invasion of Beleriand during this Elven Civil War that the elves of every kingdom would be nearly all completely defeated, with the only remaining factions being the hidden cities of Gondolin, Nargothrond, and a few elves at the havens of the Falas. While Fëanor could perhaps escape into the wilds and would, for a time with his children, I imagine that he would be such a primary target for the forces of Morgoth, Thingol, and Fingolfin during this strife that he would almost certainly be slain at some point, though Thingol would also be killed in the fighting, as would many of the men who were enthralled to Fëanor. With the deaths of all his major enemies and the retreat and hiding of the rest, Morgoth would have used the Elven Civil War and his massive armies to take over Middle-earth, with little loss on his behalf. The Silmaril that Beren took, however, would make its way to the elves of the Falas, who would send it west with a desperate and final plea for aid from the Valar. It could not have been Eärendil and Elwing, for they likely would not be born in this timeline, and rather I imagine either Beren and Luthien or Círdan the Shipwright, or some other notable elf, would carry this to Valinor and break the ban of the Noldor perhaps, becoming a star in the sky afterwards. The Valar would almost need to accept this plea and send aid to Middle-earth, for no children of Eru could live as intended if they would not. So the War of Wrath would happen much earlier on in the First Age, and even though it would be a much closer battle between the forces of the Valar and the forces of Morgoth, and the direct intervention of all of the Valar would be needed, they would beat Morgoth in the end, and Beleriand would also find its end. However, there would be small amounts of men and elves left in the world, at least this far west, and men who had been enslaved by Fëanor, who were most of the Edain, would never trust the elves in friendship again. As for the elves, Gil-galad, who had been sent to the Havens, might survive as their High King, but many of the elves we know from the canon would not have existed in this dark, dreadful timeline, following the civil war of the elves and invasion of Morgoth, due to the pride and arrogance of Fëanor. Likely this would clear a path to Sauron's eventual victory in Middle-earth, further dividing the Free Peoples, unless the Valar intervened once more. But that, however, would be the most likely outcome, in my theory at least, concerning what if Fëanor survived. His ambition, arrogance, pride, and lust for vengeance and power would likely see the Noldor collapse, even as he saw Morgoth as his own greatest enemy. He would be but a pawn for the Dark Lord's evil in the end, becoming too much like Morgoth in his pursuit of vengeance. From this tale, we see that we must remember that we must reunite to be at our strongest, and to do that we must put aside our personal vices in the pursuit of the greater good. Hey everyone, Yoyston here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. The timing of the tone of this video might not be great, but I do wish you all a Merry Christmas and a Happy Holidays as well. And despite the dark tone of today's video, I hope you all had a truly wonderful, bright, and joyful day. I hope you all enjoyed this theory as well. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and share this with a friend. What are your thoughts on this topic? If Fëanor survived, what do you believe would have happened? Let me know in the comments below. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider getting some candles from our friends Mythologie Candles through the link in the description below. Please check out our merch and Patreon. Thanks to our Valar tier patrons and YouTube members, Peter Shepard, Jonathan Putnam, Mark Kralik, Blair Scout and Merchant, John Hume, Sam McBee, Matt Sabach, Elizabeth Calvert, Maz Gibbs, Reese Jenkins, Anna Petrolik, Anthony Harmon, Orban Gray, Arthur Merlin, DJ Vaught, Dale Davis, Alex Grimes, King's Wild Project, our newest Valar tier patron. Please subscribe and hit that bell button to join the Men of the West and all of the Free Peoples today. And I'll see you all again next Sunday with a video on the 5 most powerful good and evil beings in the First Age. You all are the best, my friends. Thank you all so much for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one.